So similar to the previous step, analyzing retention and optimizing your app is for retention, fixing retention issues is a continuous process. So it generally starts by identifying a negative trend, like for instance, a drop in your active users, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly, depends on what is more relevant for you. But how to get started when you want to identify issues in your app. So the first thing we recommend doing is that you visualize your user journeys and the user flow and look for uncommon exit screens. Then with this, you can easily identify bottlenecks in the journey, and then you can get into the qualitative analysis, like the way we discussed before. And there's one more thing that is important when you're looking at retention metrics is also looking at feature adoption and identifying low feature adoption, which can also often lead drops in retention. And then, of course, the last step, one before the last, you will move to crafting and validating your hypothesis, if that's correct, based on your both quantitative and qualitative findings. And then you again will improve or set up your dashboards and improve them over time if you've already had them, as you will go along the process. But as again, let's look at a quick example of how does this look like in real life, how does this work? So as we said, the first step is to analyze the journeys. So in UXCam, we have something called app navigation, which will help you to see how users are navigating through the app. Again, this can look a little bit daunting at first, but what is good is that you can track different journeys, because you can set what should be the starting screen that you want to analyze and what should be the ending screen, as we are analyzing retention, right? And depending on the size of your app, you can have multiple journeys that you're optimizing. And you can also further narrow this down with filters by operating systems, app versions, device types, so the ones that we've been discussing before. So here you should basically be looking, so what should you be looking at, right? So you should be looking for exit anomalies, and these are basically exit screens that should not be the last screen in the journey, so they should not be the exit screen. And this will really help you to identify problematic screens relatively quickly. And then you will start analyzing these problematic screens, right? So we've already talked about the heat map. So as we discussed before, you can do some quick checks on technical issues. And once you are on the heat map screen, you will see also the crash rate of those different screens that we talked about before. If you see no crashes, as I mentioned before, you should also check for UI freezes and bugs. And there's one more thing, it's called handled exceptions that you can also check in UXCam. These are basically problems that your developers have prepared the app for, but they are not an ideal scenario, and they should also be minimized. And if the issues are not technical, you've done these quick checks, then most likely, again, you are looking and facing a user experience issue. And then once you're analyzing heat maps, which is the next steps of that specific exit screen, right, that you have identified, you would be, again, as we've already discussed, looking for three main things: confusing UX design, broken UI elements, and readability and content alignment issues. And if you have, again, managed to narrow down enough the specific issues, you can dive into session replays immediately already, as you can see there on the right side from the heat maps. Or again, you can take this further and narrow down your analysis, improve it, and further segment those users in that audience who were dropping off on that specific screen. And then you can use some of the attributes that we've discussed before. And then the next one, which is part of the process in looking at drops in retention, is a low feature adoption, right? It can often be another driver, and they do not, once you release, let's say, a new version with some cool new features, they do not always work as you have imagined them to work. And in UXCam, you can quite easily track the features and how they're being used in the dashboards. But in this case, most likely you will be needing custom events as well to track them. So for example, in this case, we're looking at a shopping app where you can easily track different payment methods and whether your customers are using them or not. Let's say you've added PayPal maybe, and you will want to be checking if that's working or not. And then you can also have custom events for specific errors that are coming, for instance, from these payment methods. And then you can look at and correlate if those errors or issues are correlating to your active users dropping, and whether that is the main factor or reason why your retention metrics are dropping, basically. So yeah, before we move on to the next step, let's recap a little bit on common retention killers, so to speak, that we've seen in the past and we see with customers. So one quick example is, of course, authentication issues and OTP, which stands for one-time passwords. These sometimes don't work as they should once the user has to create that permanent password, and often results in users leaving. They've already been acquired, they set up a one-time, but they fail in setting up a permanent password, and then they're gone. And then, of course, another big one is new version adoption being low, right? So while you still have a lot of users on your old version, and what often happens is the old versions over time will get less and less support, right, from the engineering side, and then more and more crashes will occur, which can result in users leaving and churning from your app. And then lastly, a big one that we often see is biased user research findings that often follow after a beta test. So we have seen this with some of our customers. So what usually happens is users say during the user interviews that this new feature or the new version, everything there is being straightforward. But then after you release, it turns out that that's not what is actually happening. And then they're not adopting that new feature. So, and then one expert tip or one more thing that we recommend is that you analyze, segment and analyze the behavior of your power users, because this often helps you to identify creative ways of how these users are using your app, and can also give you ideas for improvements for your new features or new versions or changing your content in your app.